We're here with Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22, members of the Department of English, to chat with him about the book, and we've been joined by former Colonel Chuck Cathcart. The first question I would like to ask involves the structure of Catch-22, in which everything happens twice. I know this is a conscious structure that Joe Heller took great pains to work into the book. And I'd like to ask him, first of all, why he wanted to have everything happen twice, as it does, and secondly, to talk about déjà vu and what he thinks déjà vu means in terms of Catch-22.
Well, some things happen more than twice, or if they don't occur twice, more often than they're actually occurring twice, is the fact that I describe them 2 times or more than 2 times. So it's the author's consciousness returning to him. Other things do happen 2 or more times. There's the soldier dying of probably spinal meningitis who sees everything twice. There is a mission in the book, I think it's the mission of Ferrara, where Yossarian, the bombardier, knows if he releases his bombs he'll miss the target, so he doesn't. Then he has to go around over the target a second time, and somebody he knows is killed on that mission, and he feels responsible for that. The soldier in white comes back twice. And then there is the chaplain, who is particularly vulnerable to this phenomenon that most of us experience and we experience it for a fraction of a second, that we feel we've been in a situation before, and then that sensation leaves us, and that's called déjà vu. Now, that is a phenomenon. The chaplain experiences a relationship to everything. I was very much aware that in choosing an author's viewpoint, a perspective on the past, so much in Catch-22 has taken place before the first chapter begins. The mission of Bologna, the mission of Ferrara, the mission of Avignon, and all the consequences from them have taken place before the time of the first chapter, so that my describing of them is not merely a flashback or exposition, but it's the narrator or the central character's consciousness, Yossarian's, going back to certain things which have made a very strong impression on him. So strong an impression upon him that they seem to be occurring simultaneously with what actually is happening to him. So there is a psychological perspective at work in Yossarian. Now, as Colonel Kiley knows, because he's done more research on Catch-22 than I have, there's at least one article called Déjà Vu, or the Labyrinth of Memory, which deals with the structure of Catch-22. I did that because I felt it was the most effective way of telling this story, and it also has its philosophical complement. And that is that we are condemned to repeat so much of the past. Santayana, I think, said those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. I'm afraid that even if we remember the past, we're condemned to repeat it. And so much of what we've been through, we are going to go through again, even though we know it's coming and see it coming, because either we're helpless to stop it, to say no to ourselves or to other people, or because the events themselves have a momentum that's going to just sweep us along with us without our wanting to decide it. That is the theme of Catch-22, and it's brought out explicitly in the chapter The Eternal City, where Yossarian thinking says that somebody's got to stop this chain of inherited habit sometime, or it's going to continue this way forever. And this has to do with war and poverty and brutality and misery and tragedy, some of which can be averted, and some of it, like mortality, the inevitability of growing old and dying, it's also a character in the book, just can't be dealt with.
Is this one of the reasons for the fragmentation of what we can call the conventional novel plot or the conventional narrative? would you just talk about that for a minute? Many of us and many cadets still find greatest pleasure in reading novels that have a more conventional narrative. Why do you feel compelled to fragment the narrative?
If you're talking about me alone, or well, there's me and Catch-22, and then there are other authors who choose to tell their stories in what may to many of your students seem to be a perversely difficult way, rather than a straightforward way. I will agree with you that the straightforward conventional structure is more pleasurable. I raise a question, though, as to whether giving pleasure is the object of writing a serious novel or creating a serious work of art. Now, pleasure is a part of it, but pleasure assumes different definitions for different people. If merely to be pleasing were the purpose of art, then I don't think Beethoven would ever have progressed beyond his Second Symphony, and you wouldn't have gotten the latest. You wouldn't have gotten more than half of his piano sonatas or the last quartets. If to give pleasure to merely tell an entrancing tale were the objective, you would not have most of your great works of literature, because most of them are difficult to read, including the Bible. So that there is the charm, the enchantment of storytelling. I'm not going to, I don't mean to dismiss that. But there are other things as well that a writer or somebody wants to be a writer and thinks himself as having thoughts either about literature or about himself or about other human beings, wants to communicate, in which the idea of giving pleasure, merely making someone laugh, let's say, or telling a ghost story, becomes almost a childish enterprise. And instead, what comes into play, ideally, is a whole intelligence, hopefully a very large intelligence, that's trying to reproduce experiences that are important to him and important to his readers. There's no doubt that it's much easier to read even a novel even by Graham Greene, or let's say Love Story, or The Godfather, than it is to read Marcel Proust or Dostoevsky, or even Tolstoy, who did tell a straightforward tale, or Moby Dick, or any of Shakespeare.
Joe, could you talk a little bit about the role of symbolism? I'm thinking of your earlier discussion, specifically the soldier in white and so forth.
You mean the symbolism in Catch-22?
In Catch-22 and in writing in general.
Well, first of all, symbolism is it's probably as old as literature itself. In the earliest tales, earliest literature you have biblical or mythical. You will find even the gods themselves, the Greek gods, symbolized certain human qualities. They were objectified or personified. Let me talk about Catch-22. Catch-22, I tried to do, very consciously tried to write a novel that could be read without any consciousness of symbolism at all, without any knowledge of Shakespeare, the Bible, Herman Melville, whose narrative content and whose texture, particularly comedy, and then the violence and the violent situations that a war gives to a writer to use for moving people or sustaining interest, to write a book that could be read on that level alone. At the same time, I did virtually saturated with symbolism, some of them whimsical, some of them obvious, some of them pedantic. There are many paragraphs that paraphrase Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot, but always, I like to think, though, that always, each time I did that, the content or the context had some justification rather than the mere presentation of it. So that I begin, I may be wandering away from far afield from where you're going, but I also may get back to it. The chapter that describes Milo, for example, begins with an incorrect rendition of the opening line of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The Wasteland is April is the coolest month. The chapter begins, April was the best month of all for Milo Minder. And then I go on with that, using some of Wasteland imagery for line or two, and then slide into the punchline of a joke, which is a paraphrase of Tennyson. Now, and yet I don't mention Eliot's name, and I don't mention Tennyson's, and it's not so elaborate that the reader, it'll jump out and hit the reader right between the eyes. Yet I felt that the context, Eliot writing about the wasteland, the quality of modern life, the unreal city, which I use later in the streets of Rome, is related to Milo, the Industrial Revolution, the profit motive, the ascendancy of finance and industrialism over all other values, really the destruction of patriotism, because financial considerations transcend national boundaries. So I could see a connection between Milo and what he's going to represent, and the wasteland, and T.S. Eliot. So it seemed appropriate to use a technique of T.S. Eliot's, which he also used in the wasteland for that. Almost nobody has ever asked me about this, so it shows that it's there in a way that the context itself justifies it. But there is a paraphrase of Shakespeare's description of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, used to describe the chaplain, who, although an Anabaptist, is nevertheless less a Christian. Now, there too, and I can't, usually I can quote freely from this, but it just comes up in discussion so infrequently that I can't. But if you remember Shylock's speech, it's dealing with the chaplain, the fact that he is lonely and isolated, and because he's a chaplain, everybody treats him like a chaplain. And in this prose passage, I then go into incorporating certain phrases. I don't use the word if nobody seemed to realize that he was a person like other persons, that he was warmed and cooled by the same breezes, fed, and I don't think I carried so far that if they tickle him, he laughed. I think I do use that, but I didn't go so far. If they pricked him, he bled. But there's enough in there that somebody might begin, hey, think, hey, what is this? And then read it again, and then realize what I was doing. And I was Major Blank the Coverley. If we were not having a discussion, I would not ask, I would not introduce it. But he is almost he is a parody on the very common, I think, low-class conception of the biblical God, Old Testament God. And if you read it again, I mean, the absence of a name is one indication, and the adjectives I use to describe him, they're always Jehovian nose, and a mountainous crag of a nose, and a blizzard raging above his head. And people attribute powers to him, authority, although nobody's ever seen him demonstrate them. Now, if once you know that or recognize that, you then recognize that the old man in the whorehouse is a symbol of Satan and the devil, and then those two have met and they've clashed, and the devil has won. And I've tried to invert things so that even Satan, instead of living in the underworld, lives on the top. He's in this whorehouse, which is on the very top floor of a building.
I had always thought that you'd gotten so tired of the word Roger in World War II that you couldn't say Roger become...
but then I didn't have to call him the Coverley. I could have called him Major Blank Addison.
Speaking of the symbolic import of the novel as a whole, given the world, of course, that Yossarian had to live in, and you can see, I think, that he would choose to leave, having seen that the protests that he could effectively make were few, and his life was very much in danger for no reasonable reason. But given the Roman scenes, which you commented on earlier, which implies at least that this war world is not just a function of a bomb and life. What was he fleeing to symbolically?
At the end of the book, is that when you want to mark the beginning of his flight, because he refuses duty, he refused to fly on missions before that. Yes. He is fleeing to nothing at the end except freedom of will, the right to make a decision for himself, even though it was a very hard decision, contrary to what other people think of it. I often am asked, wasn't he copping out? If you're going to cop out, the easiest way would have been to accept those conditions as they were, which would have guaranteed him a promotion, speeches, he would have been a hero, he would have become part of the establishment, and the physical safety he wanted. That would have been the easy way. It was a way he regarded as a corrupt way. He does not think he will get to Sweden. I think he says that several times. If I were rewriting the book, I wouldn't change the ending, but I would emphasize that part more. He hopes to get to Rome, and from there, as he says, he'll take his chances. But for the first time in that book, and maybe for the first time in his life, and maybe there will come a time in our lives, he is making a decision of his own and acting upon it. And the sense of exhilaration that he experiences at the end was not an exhilaration because he knows he's going to be in Sweden next day. Now, so many people have missed that, or have come to that interpretation. I feel that there was a failure. I should have made that more clearly. The exhilaration stems from his answer to the line, Major Danby tells me you'll never get there, and he says, oh hell, I know that, but at least I'll be trying.
And Orr did.
What? Well, Orr did, yes, but he's not Orr. And he hasn't a chance in hell of getting there. Well, he's too reactive a personality. Orr got there by keeping his own counsel, trusting nobody, planning and plotting methodically, putting out a false face to everybody, including Yossarian, and doing this months or perhaps years in advance, having an uncanny, intuitive intelligence, which is so acute that it warns him not to let anybody know he even has it. And he comes close to making one mistake when he almost tells Yossarian, or when he invites Yossarian, he gets shot down with it. Come on missions with me. He's really inviting him to come along and get shot down with me, and I'll row you to Sweden. But he doesn't tell him all that. Now that would have been a mistake because Yossarian would have capsized that raft, and
Orr has immense practical skills, none of which Yossarian has.
Right. Yes.
Guarantee him a world-class income for the rest of his life.
Yeah, exactly.
The phrase Catch-22. I know in 1955 the first chapter was published as Catch-18, and the title changed.
Yes.
Around publication time.
Yeah, all right. It was called 18 right up until the time type was going to be set for the book, and the number 18 had no symbolic value at all. And it was changed because through Publishers Weekly, which is a trade publication of the book industry, we learned that Leon Uris was going to publish a novel called Mila 18 a month before, or a few weeks before Catch-22 was going to come out, and that created, really, it's going to sound humorous, but it's really a terrible problem for a first novel by somebody unknown to have a title similar to a novel by somebody very well known coming out. Things like that still happen occasionally, and in that case the well-known novelist will get the attention. And it's hard enough for a new novelist to get his book reviewed or get into a bookstore to begin with. Oddly enough, I used to say this as a joke, but I think it's true. I think people will not want to read two books with the same word in the title within the same year. So if they had the same number in the title, they would not want to read. I know the two books came out, they're each on the bestseller list, but the Once and Future King came out at a time when somebody else had a book out with King in the title. And I read them both, but I didn't want to read them in the same year because they were King in the title. So then there was no doubt the title had to be changed, and I was useless in this situation because for 8 years or 7 years I've been thinking of 18 and found reasons why no other number would do. There were cuckoo reasons, like no other number sounded right because no other number begins with a vowel except 11, which has one syllable too many, and Catch ends with a choking mouthful of consonants, so you have to have a vowel, it has to be followed by a vowel. And all of that made sense to us for weeks, and but we knew it didn't. And it was my editor who called up one day and said he thinks he has the right title, and he said 22. And as soon as he said 22, I said, you're right, because I saw that the number 2 repeated as reflecting much of the structure of the book and then much of the thematic material of the book.
I've been telling my classes that 22 was ideal because if everything happened twice and this is repetitive.
Well, that's the reason. It is the reason why, when he said he thinks he has it, that he thought he had the right number, and why I said you're right.
That's then a feather in my cap and not a black.
That's another example of intuition working too.
Well, somebody has since told me that in numerological philosophy, 22 has a significance. It's associated with great disasters. And they were the biggest train wreck in history occurred on the 22nd of a certain month, or the 22nd week of the 22nd year. And then somebody else, occasionally, as all of us know, analytical criticism can go pretty far afield. Somebody says 22 has value in playing the tarot cards, because there are 44 cards in the deck and 22 are wild cards, or 22 are jokers. Now, this may be true, but I didn't know. And there are 44 chapters in the book, and 22 wild cards in the tarot deck. And I think chapter 22 is called Wintergreen, and there is a Winter King that's one of the tarot cards. Now, and there are a few other coincidences like that, but that was
The miracle ingredient, Z, what is it, 349?
oh yeah, Z247. Somebody told me is an element.
Einsteinium.
Einsteinium, and then I mentioned Einstein later. But that's the advantage. If you write a big book and you fool around with so many things that have either real symbolic or pseudo-symbolic value. Many times I use symbols to parody symbolism, and I'm using literary allusions to parody literary criticism, because at the time I was writing the book, new criticism was very strong. One of the advantages is you pick up fringe benefits like Einstein, Z247. I think of a novel as having a happy ending, an ending on a note of elation, a note of positive possibilities, and if one wanted to reflect back to a few of the conversations that he's had with the chaplain Danby, and even I think Havemeyer jumping out of the bushes. The consequences of doing this is to bring some type of attention, some type of scandal down upon the colonels, and perhaps to encourage the other men to refuse to fly too. I mean, if Yossarian accepts their deal and tells a lie, then the other men are going to go on doing what they're told to do. There even is that line. Now, see, I think of this as being a symbolic line, although it's not symbolic so much as a novel. Has connotative overtones. I'm either speaking of Havemeyer or other men who, when Yossarian is walking around backwards in the squadron, now backwards is symbolic, who jump out of bushes at night to ask him how he's doing. Now, in the daytime, in other words, I describe the fact that in the daytime they pretend not to notice him, or they don't speak to him. But at night they hide, and just to find out is he going to get away with it or not. And even Havemeyer wants to cash in on it without taking any risk if it works. So that Yossarian has put himself in a test case position as far as they are concerned. When the facts are revealed to him in lines that I like, I think also prophetic, that the government can produce as many witnesses. There's an official document that says one thing, they say, but they can produce as many official documents as they want to testify to others.
That's one of the remarkable qualities. The book almost becomes a sort of a symbolic forecasting prototype of the whole Vietnam experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I wouldn't dare say that.
I have students that go to class thinking that you've just written a book in the last year or two about Vietnam.
Yeah. I do try to end the novel more on a question than on an answer. There are situations in which we find ourselves in which there is no easy answer, no comfortable answer, even no answer that is ethically correct for all people, even all ethical people, outside of a single situation that will work tomorrow. We might find a solution that will work today for us in a situation, but it's not going to work for all of us tomorrow. One or the other might have misgivings. Now, the situation Yossarian is in at the end of the book is not a comfortable one to be in. It's a situation that during the past 5, 6, or 7 years was very close to that of a young American who did not want to go into the Army, regardless of the condition. But let's assume that in this particular war, he did not want to go into this war, and he is 1A, and he's going to be drafted. Now, there are many ways, or several ways, of keeping out of the Army, and others of keeping out of combat. And Yossarian, although he's already in, has alternatives which correspond to those available to him. He can refuse to go and go to prison, and many 7, 8, or 10,000 did that. He can desert and go to Canada or go to Sweden. He can say, well, I don't believe in it, I don't want to do it, it's wrong, or I'm scared, or it's not worth dying for, risking for, but if that's what they want me to do, I'll do it. Or he can bribe his way out, or get a psychiatrist to give him a letter, to find some dishonorable way or some deceitful way out of it. Now, those seem to correspond to Yossarian's position at the end of the war, and none are comfortable for him. And yet I think I organized the book in a way that he took the only one that would be consistent with what preceded it.
Well, many people forget, I think.
You probably forgot the question you wanted to ask me.
No, he's flown 71 missions. Many people forget.
That's another thing. When the book begins, he's flown 41. And he wants to get out. He goes to see Major almost immediately. When the book ends, he has flown 71 missions. He has been wounded, and he's gone back to flight duty, even despite the wound. And so all this time, he has been obeying orders, which is to continue flying missions. Now, there are times he goes in the hospital to Malinga. I don't think there's a time in the book, though, when he's not ready to break down. Each time he goes into the book, once he's in combat, it follows something that's happened that comes in the nature of a shock to him. And each time he goes in, he resolves never to come out, and then each time he does come out, and he goes back to combat duty. And all this while, he does when he can't face the Bologna mission, and he can't face the Bologna mission. He's not a guy trying to get out of combat duty so he can cash in on the black market. The terror is so big for him that he just can't face it. He sabotages the intercom. He goes back, and he is almost immediately enveloped with an overwhelming sense of guilt at what he's done. If you remember, he has to take his clothes off and go swimming and try to cleanse himself, and he has a fantasy of these mushrooms growing up all around him, and he is not even comfortable with that action. And he is going following legitimate channels to try to get off combat duty. He sees his squadron commander, Major, who says, there's nothing I can do. He sees his flight surgeon, who says, there's nothing I will do. I can do it, but I'm not going to stick my neck out. And gives him a further bit of information that you're right. You are being asked to fly more missions here than they are in other squadrons. He goes to the chaplain, who's trying to look for, needs help himself. He goes to Wintergreen at headquarters to see if it's true that they're being asked to fly more missions, and they are. And then Wintergreen won't help him because Wintergreen wants to be with the winners. He goes to Milo. Milo won't help him because he believes everybody should do his duty. And if it's Yossarian's duty to get killed over Bologna, then he should die like a man. I remember I use that phrase there too, that in a funny way. I think he is like a man, accept your fate like a man. Go out and die. Who else but a man would go out and do that, and not take off in the other direction, unless it's a lemming.
Well, I have an ambivalent feeling about the final scene. Because you surround Yossarian with Danby and with Tapman, who are either the two weakest characters you could surround him with so that his change would look strong, or maybe they're the only two that are really around. Everybody else is dead.
Everybody else is dead. All the other combat men who would be sympathetic to him. There's nobody else in the book who would give a rational argument for his doing other than he's done. I mean, he's heard Colonel Korn's argument for corruption. He knows the threat that he will get from Colonel Cathcart or from whoever the general is, which is court-martial. I also should say that in the book, things are manipulated. I mean, I've arranged the ending of the book so that these are the only possibilities available to him. Even collective action is no longer possible to him. That was not a fact when I was writing the book, and it would not have occurred to me to put it in. But early in the book, one of the men, Dobbs, has suggested assassinating the colonel, and Yossarian found the idea repulsive. And there again, there's an allusion to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra when...
in the barbers on the barge?
Yeah, on the barge. When he says, not Eno, is it Eno Barbers? Yeah. He says to Pompey, yeah, he says, you've got him here. I can cast off and we can cut their throats. And he said, if you'd done it without asking me, it would have been good service. But if you ask me, I'm a host and I can't say yes. Well, Yossarian says, if you'd gone ahead and done it, you know. But he can't say it. But even Dobbs is dead then. Now, it is a manipulated ending. Yossarian also is manipulated. It's the reason I made him an Assyrian at the beginning, so he can be the only one left at the end. He is just about the last member of a breed that's in danger of growing extinct. But I think the ending, no matter who is left to do it, is one that's going to be decided by persuasion. Now, the chaplain has come to him to talk him out of doing what he's doing. Major Danby has come to him to persuade him to take the deal. I don't know who else there is in the book or in the world of Catch-22 who could come to Yossarian and give him a persuasive reason for doing or for accepting what other course. Yeah. I mean, you give me the alternative. I mean, again, consider the alternatives. The only one that would be persuasive would be one toward corruption. I don't know if you know the famous story in journalism, and if you don't, I'll tell it to you. You have enough tape for another minute and a half? Yes. This was first published in the New York Times house organ, which goes to newspapermen in other places, and it had to do. And I got it when somebody at the Times mailed it to me, and then somebody in England on the newspaper mailed it to me from the New York Times house organ. It was a briefing in Saigon, intelligence briefing of the press. And an Army officer came out and said he has good news. He says, I'm happy to announce that Army casualties this week increased to a point where they're equal to those of the Marines. And somebody, I think either an English or an American journalist said, Major, you don't really mean that you're happy when you announce the increase in casualties, are you? And he says, yes, I definitely do. Now we can take our place with the Marines. And at this point, the French journalist turned to the man from the London paper and said, I can't believe it, I'm hearing. And one or the other, I like to think it's a Frenchman who said, Catch-22.